Hi, everybody. This is Class Sailors. This is Class in 60 Seconds live on Facebook, where we have really interesting conversations, 15, 20-minute conversations with folks whose work intersects with our work at Family Promise. And as you all know, Family Promise is the largest national organization addressing the issue of family homelessness. And I'm really, really excited about today's guest because there is such a powerful intersectionality between structural racism, housing, and homelessness. And before I introduce my guest, I'll cite some of the work of her organization, the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. Last year, they published a study on the impacts of redlining, and out of that came a really, really powerful statistic, which was for every dollar of wealth that a white New Jersey household has, a Latino household has about 2 cents, and a Black household has slightly less than 2 cents. That's a 50-to-1 ratio, which actually is disproportionate to the U.S. overall. And I think it's really significant because it's not that New Jersey is magnitudes more racist than other states, but that housing is such a driver of wealth in this country. When you have hyperinflated housing costs as you have in New Jersey, then you hyperinflate those disparities. And I think it's a real instructive point about why housing, homelessness, and structural racism are so inextricably tied together. So with that, I'm going to invite my guest on, Dr. Nichole Nelson. She is a Mellon ACLS Public Fellow and Policy Analyst at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. So I want to welcome Dr. Nelson.
Thank you so much, class.
I got it right, didn't I?
Yes.
Okay. Every time I have these long titles, it's great having people with long titles because obviously it's very impressive, but it puts a lot of pressure on me to get those titles right.
Gotcha.
So, Dr. Nelson, let me just start with that core question, right? We have this disparity by race in home ownership across the U.S. and New Jersey, and in my intro I kind of talked about what sort of the implications of that are. Why does it matter, and what maybe do a little bit about the historical reasons for that disparity?
Sure. So it matters because home ownership is the primary means by which most Americans accumulate wealth. So the fact that there's this disparity between Black Americans and white Americans in home ownership, where Black Americans have lower rates of home ownership compared to white Americans, that directly contributes to Black Americans having lower rates of wealth compared to white Americans. And there are a couple historical reasons for that disparity in home ownership. As the Institute covered in its first housing report released last year, Erasing New Jersey's Red Lines, we covered a number of historical reasons, including redlining, racially restrictive covenants, Black Americans' exclusion from the GI Bill, from the home ownership benefits of the GI Bill, and most recently, predatory lending. And redlining, I just want to zoom in on in particular, because redlining was when the government assessed different neighborhoods for loans for homes, and assessed their risk. And it assigned risk or lack of risk based on race. So neighborhoods that were mostly white or all white received higher ratings, and they were likely to get loans for homes. But neighborhoods that were Black, most of the time they were redlined and they received the lowest rating, and they were denied those loans for homes. Hence, that directly contributed to Black Americans' lower rates of home ownership.
And it's interesting, redlining, and we had Dr. Keisha Moore do a great webinar for us on redlining last year, and we continue to lean in on it because it's such a critical component, and I think one of the more understandable ones. And it's interesting, I don't know if you've seen the maps of communities where you map redlining against evictions. And generally speaking, right, the redline communities that were historically Black and brown, disenfranchised, have the much higher rates of evictions, with one exception, because you'll see sometimes low rates of evictions because it is formerly redline communities that have gentrified. They're really, it's horrifying, but it's really fascinating as well too. So you talked about how this is a driver for wealth, and I led in with that statistic. from your organization about that ratio difference on wealth.
Mhm.
Can you talk a little bit more about that and sort of some of the connections between wealth and structural racism and sort of the illusions of equity that we have and how this sort of lays that bare?
Sure. So I will say, let's say if we look at the effects of redlining in the present day, two communities that come to mind are Newark and its suburban counterpart of Millburn, and they're just a few miles away. And Newark, it's a largely Black city. It's about 50% Black. It was redlined in the 1930s, and it has a median home value of a little less than $250,000. And again, it's a Black city. But if you compare Millburn, which is a predominantly white suburb, it has home values of a little over $1 million. And I should also mention Newark has very low home ownership rates at about 23% compared to Millburn, where most people in Millburn own their own homes. So you see these drastic disparities. So I will say, where you live still determines your access to opportunities. The amount of wealth in your community determines whether, let's say, there's an abundance of grocery stores where you can purchase fresh fruits and vegetables, determines your access to quality schools, decent housing, etc. So I'll say that off the bat. And then these illusions of equity and other things that you mentioned, I would say that it shows that while the struggles of the past with the civil rights movement were really good at toppling de jure segregation and ensuring that Black Americans have access to equal access to public accommodations and don't face segregation and things of that nature, that we still have subtle forms of racism that persist. We still have this elephant in the room, which is these economic disparities dating back to this lack of access to home ownership. And of course, dating even further back than that with American chattel slavery. So I would say that there's a lot of work that needs to be done to address these economic disparities.
And I think one of the stats is that the rate of Black home ownership has not increased, right? So to your point, we have the ending of sort of legal segregation and sort of legal disenfranchisement to some degree. You can make arguments, of course, around incarceration and other elements, but you have that kind of facade. But undergirding that is you don't have any kind of substantive change in power and wealth, right, which are pretty closely tied in this country. So do you have any thoughts about why the rate of Black homeownership has not increased over time, even though you theoretically have more equality in society?
One of the first things that comes to mind is a failure to enforce the Federal Fair Housing Act of 1968. So how can people buy a home? How can Black people buy homes at equal rates if they're being discriminated against when they go to buy a home? So that's one reason that comes to mind. And the Fair Housing Act of 1968 was meant to correct those disparities, so that, you couldn't be discriminated against when you buy a home. You couldn't say, oh, this home is no longer for sale when a Black family comes to buy it, but then magically when a white family comes to buy it, it's for sale, it's on the market again. I would also say that given that racism is embedded in the housing market as its natural state, right? So redlining, the practice ended, but there's other ways that racism still exists in the housing market that are just more subtle and harder to detect. And to correct that, to overcome some of that, I think we need more targeted programs, or I should say programs that better serve Black Americans. So I think we really need to evaluate some of the home ownership programs that exist and see what can be done to make them more effective for Black Americans.
Yeah, thank you. And we've seen that these articles, there's been a spate of articles about assessments and other elements, horrific stories of people having to remove evidence of blackness from their homes to be able to get equitable treatment. And I think too, what you've talked about just in terms of wealth generation, you need wealth in order to acquire housing. So, it is hard to increase numbers of home ownership if you don't have the wealth in the community to be able to purchase the housing, particularly as housing has accelerated in value relative to wages and other costs of other goods. So what are there any other steps that you would recommend that we can take around homeownership? You talked about the enforcement of the Fair Housing Act and other elements. Is there anything else that you would add to that, Dr. Nelson?
Yeah, I'm thinking, and the thing that popped up that just comes to mind is testing. Testing of real estate agents, testing of landlords, making sure that there's no discrimination, and that testing reveals the subtle signs of discrimination, right? So again, racism has become more covert since the Fair Housing Act of 1968 was passed. So testing to ensure that Black people and other groups, other protected classes under the Federal Fair Housing Act aren't being discriminated against, but in this case, Black Americans, since we're talking about race. So that's one thing that definitely comes to mind.
So thank you for that. And let me ask you, we're referencing a lot of history here, and right, there's ways of looking at history, and there's ways of saying there is progress in history. Obviously, ending chattel slavery is progress. On the other hand, there's ways of saying there's really not significant progress when you're looking at the carceral state and so on, right? So you have these sort of different ways of looking at history. Looking forward, are you optimistic or pessimistic about changing that wealth disparity, changing that the issues around home ownership, and I guess where talk a little bit about that, how you feel about that, and how you feel we might be able to achieve a more positive future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say I'm realistic, but I lean more towards optimism. I would say that I know the history of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and I know that we haven't had much substantive enforcement of the Fair Housing Act since George Romney was HUD secretary from about 1969 to 1973. But I'm also optimistic because of the Biden administration, their recent news announcement where they announced that they were going to reinstate affirmatively furthering fair housing, as well as do other things like trying to have increased down payment assistance, which would help, which as a result, hopefully would make more Black Americans homeowners. So I would say I am cautiously optimistic. Yeah.
Yeah, it was an impressive thing in the platform, because you don't usually see such a focus on fair housing in housing platforms for candidates. It was, it was a pretty sweeping and encouraging approach. So I'll wrap up just with this. So you're not a native of New Jersey, right?
No.
And where are you from originally?
Long Island, New York.
Okay. So you crossed over to the other side here. How do you like New Jersey so far?
I like it. It was odd moving during a pandemic, but I'm enjoying New Jersey. Yeah, I'm enjoying it so far.
Well, we're very happy to have you, and we're so thrilled to the work of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. I just think it's such a powerful force. And actually, why don't you take a moment and just talk a little bit more about it? A lot of our viewers are from New Jersey. They should be familiar with it. And if you're not from New Jersey, it is worth looking into, because it's got some really outstanding analyses and policy statements. So we'll finish up with kind of a quick scope and a note of full disclosure. My good friend Diana de Jesus Medina is a board member at the New Jersey Institute. And actually, just Dr. Nelson, an interesting little dynamic here is one of your founders was Dick Debevoise, who was a co-parishioner of mine at St. Stephen's Church in Millburn, New Jersey.
Oh, wow.
Just to kind of square the circle. But anyhow, just talk a little bit about the Institute so people know more about it, and then we'll wrap up. Thank you.
Yeah, so the Institute is a law and social advocacy organization that works to improve the lives of Black and Brown New Jerseyans in the arenas of criminal justice reform, economic justice, and democracy and justice. We've been around since 1999. I'm honored and thrilled to work for the Institute. Yeah, I'm excited to join them in their work.
Yeah, well, they're very lucky to have you, and yeah, they do fantastic work on housing. They do a lot of work on criminal justice and kind of anything that you can imagine that's in the social justice area. Well, Dr. Nelson, welcome to New Jersey.
Thank you.
Yeah, we hope you stay here a long time and do great things here. Thank you for a fantastic, fantastic discussion, and have a terrific weekend.
Thank you. You too.